Grab a glass of wine, cup of coffee, whatever your little passion is. Come have a seat. Hi, Leah. Let's see. What are my thoughts on rejection sensitivity dysmorphia? Um, that's that is an interesting question. I don't know that I've read anything about it. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Michelle. Um, Let me answer this, then I'll address that. Um, I have not read anything about it being dysmorphic. So it's not something that I've needed to kind of catch up on. Obviously, there are people who have hyper, and I guess I would have called it hyper rejection sensitivity almost always because of trauma, rejection trauma. Hi, Holly. Oh, that's a sweet thing to say. Dysmorphic. Yeah, I understand what she said. Thank you for that, Nick. Um, my point is that I don't know that I have enough information to even speak about it as a defined piece. If you have a particular question about hypersensitivity to rejection and how that impacts, um, what the impact of that is, I'm happy to try to um, dysphoric. Hmm. Did I did I even read that wrong? Dysphoric? Did you say? Oh, you said dysphoria. Yeah. What was I saying? Oh God, now I'm all confused. I confuse myself. You know how I am by 9 o'clock at night. Um, so I don't want to say something stupid, and I don't want to be dismissive. What do you say when you just want to be treated the way you treat others? Like the golden rule. For example, he does things to me that if I did to him, he'd flip out. When I say, why do you do that? You wouldn't want it done for yourself. All you ever do is compare, compare, compare. Okay, well, that could be a little bit narcissistic. You know what I think part of the problem is? Hello, Caitlin. People are different, right? And we think that if we do this for you, you're going to notice that and you're going to reciprocate it back from me. And this goes a little bit to love languages. Now, it's not that simple, obviously, but it goes a little bit to love languages. If I understand love as looking like this, and so I treat you this way, but you understand love as looking like this, and so you're going to treat me that way, and we're not on the same wavelength, we're going to be thinking that we love each other to death, but we're going to be missing every time we reach out. it's it's so important to understand or to learn how my partner thinks about love. Like how does my partner understand love? It's a question I ask every couple that comes to my office. What is happening when you feel loved? What is happening when you feel loved? Ask your partner that, so that you have a better understanding. Some people say, I feel loved when he's holding me. I feel love when she is watching my ball game. I feel loved when blank, blank, blank. And if we can really get to a place where we understand how our partner feels loved, more often than not, men tell me all the time that if it meant their marriage, they wouldn't necessarily have to be physical as long as those other things were met. But so many men have no idea what those other things are. And so kind of like when people just say all the emotions they know are happy, sad, man, happy, sad, happy, sad, mad. There's so many other emotions. And most men, a lot of men, I'll say a lot of men, don't know how to express themselves except through physical interactions. It's not an excuse. It's not appropriate. We need to teach. It needs to be taught. But I think that it's such an important topic. I think love's all about communication, and once you have the feeling, you try to change. Hello, baking. Learning someone is like a love language. That's true, but keep in mind, it's not just as simple as a love language, right? Overwhelmingly in my office, women tell me they want more emotional connection. And this is what Nat really talks about. If you connect with her emotionally, if she feels like you desire her, then you won't have to worry about it. But if she thinks that all you want is the physical part, she's going to rebel against that. And Nat, it's totally true about multilingual. It's like you're speaking Russian, I'm speaking French, and we are totally misunderstanding. There was a session this morning, they were talking about cleaning. And he is super frustrated about when he says, listen, would you clean up in here? And she says, well, I'd rather clean when we're together. Like when you're with me, I think it's more important. And this has been a source of conflict. And today, literally today, they've been together for several years. Today, for the first time, they investigated the understanding of their word clean, of the word clean. And in her mind, clean meant you get out the bucket, the rubber gloves, the Lysol, the sponges, and you go deep clean a room. And in his mind, cleaning up meant tidy. And so every time he made a comment about cleaning up, she's like, I just can't believe you keep wanting so much more from me. And he's like, how is it more? Just to pick up your shoes or put away your glass. He meant tidy. But this is a perfect example of the kind of miscommunication that happens in relationships all over the world daily. People don't think to describe in their head the thing that they are picturing. And today I made the comment about expectations. And I made it literally on the heels of that session, and how when we feel disappointed, we are constantly, or when we feel disappointed, that's an indication of a failed expectation. Now the problem is we have all these subliminal expectations all the time, and we don't necessarily know what those expectations are until we feel disappointed, and then we're super quick just to blame somebody for letting us down, when maybe part of the problem is I wasn't aware that I needed to ask for that because I didn't know that we weren't on the same page. And so it goes back to communication. Thank you. Or whoever's, yes, thank you. There needs to be self-exploration. Yes. Love language may equate to unmet needs. Sometimes, when we don't understand somebody's love language, and I tell couples all the time that we kind of have like this 50-50 responsibility between accepting what they're giving us and telling them what we need. And that this is the example I use. When Harlan was sick, well, even before he was sick, really, he would go to bed at like 9 o'clock at night. He was out. But especially when he was sick. And because he was sick, I was stressed about the time that we got to spend together. Now, he would get up in the morning and be at the shop. He owned a printing company. He'd be at the shop by 8:30 in the morning. I didn't even get into work until 12 or 1 o'clock. And then I didn't get home until 8:30 or 9 o'clock. So our schedules were off just that little bit. But it was enough that it kind of interrupted the amount of time that we had together. So he would come home early, and my ask of him is, would you go home and get a nap? And then that way I don't come home to an empty house. You can be up for a little bit and we can chat. And because my love language is time, the gift of time. And inevitably, I would come home and he would be in bed, lights out, and he just couldn't stay up. And I know I asked him, I was going to say 100 times, realistically 30 or 40 times. We probably had that conversation, heavy duty conversation about it 10 times. And he just couldn't. It wasn't, for some reason, a part of who he was. Once he went to bed, he was out. But there was always a glass of wine on the counter with a little note that said, I couldn't stay up, but I love you, honey. Now, to be honest, I didn't give two shits about the wine, right? That wasn't important to me. I've had tons of time since his death to drink wine. What I wanted was his time. And there was just something about who he was that couldn't shift gears to give me that particular kind of time. Now, he gave me time in different ways. My point of this conversation or this story is to let you know that sometimes if it's not a deal breaker, if it's not one of those deal breaker things, then sometimes it's partly our responsibility to notice what they do and feel appreciative or be appreciative, accepting and appreciative of that, because nobody is going to be all things. And we have to be mature enough and realistic enough to really understand that. Baking, you don't know your love language? Answer the question, I feel loved when, and write down 10 things. There's a pretty good chance that those 10 things will fall into kind of similar categories. Try that exercise, and if you want to share the list, I'm happy to give you some thoughts. And Tanya, if you, there's a book called The 5 Love Languages, and it's an excellent explanation of all those, all the different love languages and how people with different love languages can kind of interact together. It's a good book. Any advice for people with ADHD? Let's see. I mean, I guess there's a book's worth of advice. Why don't you give me a specific question, like in maybe an area that you struggle in or that you're curious about? In terms of ADHD, I think, one of the things, I got a little bit of slack last week on a video about interrupting people. And there were a whole lot of comments about, well, I have ADHD, so I just tell people I have ADHD, so I can't, if I don't interrupt you, I can't remember what I was going to say. And with all due respect to everybody who struggles with ADHD, I don't generally accept that that's a good reason to interrupt someone, right? You're still essentially saying, well, I'm not going to be able to remember, so what I have to say is more important than finishing listening to you. Medium, hello. And so I'm not trying to call anybody out, but I do think that if you know that about yourself, get in the habit of making a note saying, excuse me, would you hold that thought just for a second? I need to write something down. I don't want to interrupt you, so I just need to write this down so I don't forget. That's perfectly acceptable. I think that, you can say, I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for a second? There were also lots of people who said, what about the people who never shut up? And fair question, there are lots of people like that, in which case you say, I'm sorry, Matt, can I interrupt and go back to a point you made earlier for some clarification? I didn't want to go too far off topic before we maybe finish that. That's perfectly acceptable. But you say, excuse me, do you mind if I interrupt? Be polite about it instead of just jumping in. Because when you're jumping in, you're not demonstrating consideration for the person who's speaking. Now, maybe they aren't demonstrating consideration for you, but two wrongs don't make a right. Right? Two wrongs don't make a right. And I totally get that it can be super frustrating. I'm at the, right, cheers. I'm at the age where I suffer from CRS. And so if you're listening and I have a question, there's a really strong possibility that I will not remember my question. Or if I'm listening and you know what I'm saying. There's a strong possibility that I won't remember. But that what I'm supposed to be doing in that moment is listening, because somebody else is talking. In communication, there's two roles. You're not doing nothing, you're listening. And if you're a good listener, the person that's talking may feel heard and change their behavior. One of the reasons people who just talk nonstop do that is because they often say that they don't feel heard. And so they have to say the same thing 22 different ways so that you'll get it. That's often the case. And if you're having an argument or you're trying to have a serious conversation, use an egg timer. That's an effective thing. Now, some people, I'll do that in my sessions sometimes, and some people say, well, I can't get my thought out in 2 minutes. Okay. Then perhaps it's important to really think about or put some thought into a more concise way of pulling together your point so that your partner can be a more effective listener. Yes, Franny, you totally can bring that up. And I think that there's some real value, right? And this is true both in Black homes, in Italian homes. People say all the time, oh no, she finishes my sentences. Sisters will often do that. Gosh, sitting around with a bunch of Italian women who have been related for 25 years. They're all talking all over each other. So I'm not really talking about the conversations where people are just chatting. I'm really more talking about the conversations where we're trying to resolve something. We're trying to settle conflict. We're trying to share feelings. Those are the conversations when listening and speaking becomes super important, because you're 100% right that when there's any kind of dynamic where there's a pattern of sharing that space, I think that it's acceptable. Yeah. I'll just kind of leave it there. So see, that kind of brings me to the point of people think they're saying something in a way, think they're saying something in a way that you can understand. That's why reflective listening can be such an effective tool, right? Because if somebody says, so what I just heard was blank, 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 and that's not what the speaker was attempting to convey, you can go back and change it. But if I start acting or responding on an assumption of what I heard, and we've been challenged to have clear communication, then that can be problematic. People talking over hurt your feelings. See, that's a really good example of why, even if I have ADHD, right? And that's my excuse. That's me. If I have that and I'm talking, if I don't know the person well that I'm talking to, I might be hurting their feelings. And don't use ADHD as an excuse when we have the technology to just take a little note, or write something real quick, unless they're going on and on and on. And then it's very, very valid to be able to say, I'm sorry, can I interrupt just for a moment? Because I want to go back to this point before I forget. So I think you can interrupt under certain conditions when you do it with respect for the person who's speaking. Yeah. So I hope that helps and kind of settles that. Maybe the better approach to ADHD is for the opposite partner to have a lot of give and take in conversation. Absolutely. Listen, conversation is a two-way street. It is never, ever, ever one-sided. But I think that's important to understand. Now, if what you're saying is, I have ADHD and I would like this concession on your part, of course you can ask. We can always ask for the things that we need. But because we're partners and it's a two-way street, we have to be willing to own whatever part is ours. And in this case, it's like, you know what, if you're really invested and you can't take a break, or you're not going to let me inject, then I'm going to write notes because I don't want to forget what I want to talk about. Who do you have control over? And this is the heart of it, right? What do I have control over? I have control over what I do, right? What was that, JJ? Where can I send a card for you to? Oh, you guys, you don't have to do that. But thank you. And I guess, medium, it's just really important. I think it's really important for us all to own what's ours, right? And I really do appreciate, I don't have ADHD, at least it's never been diagnosed. And I think most of what I'm challenged with these days is probably just capacity related for me. But because I know that that's where I am, I need to own that that's part of my challenge, right? And I'm going to either ask, because I want to demonstrate respect. If you're talking, I'm going to ask, hey, listen, can I interrupt you for a second and go back? If they say no, I'm going to say, okay. And I'm going to pick up my phone and I'm going to make a note. Because I want to remember this thing. If I start off the conversation with, hey, listen, I may interrupt you because I have ADHD, and is that okay? See, what I'm talking about is showing respect for the process of the communication. I want to be a good listener. And if I have ADHD, how can I be a good listener and still get my need met of having to pay attention to my thought? So I just want to say it's a two-way street, always, with communication. And absolutely, we can ask our partner to meet us where they're capable of meeting us. But gosh, how long did it take me to say all that? You can't say all that in a 10-second or a 30-second video. No, you don't have to listen, but I appreciate it because I listen. Let's see. He says, I don't have to listen to you, and I've never heard, just told. No, you don't have to listen, but I'd appreciated it because I listened to you respectfully. Tanya, who's saying that to you, that I don't have to listen to you? Your boyfriend of 4 years. Tanya, your boyfriend of 4 years says, I don't have to listen to you. 4 years? Hello, Kathy. Nice to see you. You live together and own house, cars, just got married. Okay. He doesn't have to listen when I try to say my feelings. Okay, girl, can I encourage you to go sit down with a therapist and share that information? Because if somebody said that my opinion was bullshit, I would, today, the woman I am today, I would walk out. My opinion matters, and so does yours. And I want you to hear me. Your opinion matters. And Grammy, it is wine time. Okay. Yeah, Tanya. Girl. I'm pretty sure, are you retired or are you still in the Marine Corps? I can't remember what you said. Stacy. Hello, you guys, old friends. Girl, I'm just going to say this to you. Your opinions matter. And you need to know that. Okay? Hey, Lauren, you're out now. You probably have veterans benefits, and I know that there are some great therapists. I know that they're really hard to get into. But your opinions matter. And I just want you to hear my voice saying that to you over and over and over again. And all of the people that are in this room that can support that sentiment, your opinions matter. What you have to say in a relationship, in a partnership, matters. A relationship cannot be a dictatorship and be successful. It can't be. It isn't emotionally healthy to be in a relationship that is a dictatorship. And while things are never 50-50, it does have to average out somewhere very close to that. over time. And so pick up some books. If you can't get into a therapist, go to the library and pick up some books on healthy communication, self-esteem, self-worth, all of that kind of stuff, and read your little heart out. I don't care if you have to hide the books under the seat in your car and go out to your car and read, or go to the park and read, go to the library and curl up and read. Read until you believe that your opinion matters and that you have a right to ask for that in a partnership. Good. I just want to tell you that there are a million women that will have your back. And there's at least 10 of them in this room that will have your back and honor that peace. But listen, if I can support you in any way, I probably can't counsel you unless you live in Pennsylvania, Maryland, or New Jersey. But if there's some way that I can support you from afar, please reach out and let me know. I have pretty good boundaries, so don't be worried. But seriously, what you have to do, good. I'm glad they do. There's a lot of other people on this app. I mean, TikTok is not a replacement for a therapist, but if that's what gives you the oomph to get through your day, to get through, then good. Holly, losing loved ones is something I need help with too. I have a hard time with death. You know, I want to share with you guys, since we're talking about this. And Holly, that's a good point. Tanya, a lot of therapists do take insurance. And because you're a vet, you probably qualify through the VA. Go ahead and get yourself on a list there. There are also a lot of therapists who do sliding scale. There's a lot of churches who have qualified therapists. Now, most of them are probably going to be faith-based therapy. But hey, that might be your vibe. And I would say that something is better than nothing, unless you just have a really hard time with somebody saying, let's pray about that. But I would say this. What was I going to say? Hello, one vexed. I am safe and well. I hope you are too. In terms of losing loved ones, and this is really true for all kinds of loss, in my opinion. And I talked about this, I think, a little bit last week. If you've dealt with death, you've probably heard the name Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. And Elisabeth Kubler-Ross is like the matriarch of grief work. She wrote a couple of books. And I'll say her understudy, one of her colleagues was David Kessler. And David Kessler and Elisabeth Kubler-Ross wrote on grief and grieving. It was actually published posthumously after her death, but they co-wrote it. I think it came out in the early 2000s. Since then, David Kessler has continued the academic research on grief and grieving and has added a sixth stage to grieving, which is meaning making. And I think it's really important to talk about meaning making. Like, what we know for sure is people who find a way to create meaning from either the life that was lived or the lesson that you learned from having had the experience with that person, and maybe even the experience with loss, if you can make meaning out of either one of those things, then we know that your grief experience is a more positive one, if you can say that grief is positive. And so meaning making becomes very, very important in the healing process. So if you have a hard time with loss, think about that a little bit. And Franny, I actually disagree with that. I think that some people go through all the stages. Other people don't. You know, and I had to learn that, you know, if a woman has been battered by her husband for, 30 years of marriage, and she sat silently by, she's probably not going to grieve the way somebody else who was best friends it warms your heart. Oh my gosh, teacher, thank you so much. It's probably they're not going to be the same grief experience. The person who hasn't seen or talked to a parent in 25 years is going to have a very, very different grief experience than the person whose dad lived next door every day of his life. And I know that we all intellectually know that, but the understanding of that and how it relates to the different quote unquote stages of grief. I had a grief counselor once tell somebody in a group, you have to get angry. That's one of the stages. And this poor woman, her husband had been suffering from ALS for more than a decade. And she's like, but I'm so relieved that he's free. Why would I be angry? And that was so powerful. You know, that there are some people who do not experience those stages. On Death and Dying, and what's interesting, if you read on Grief and Grieving, on the very first page of that book, the very first paragraph, it says that the book, which had been kind of the Bible of grief on death and dying, she said it was written, first of all, it was written from the perspective of, I'm a person who's just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. So it was really about the experience of the person who was dying that those stages were written about. And then they were transferred to this whole idea that if those people are grieving, then the people left behind are grieving. But it's a very different, it can be a very different experience. Cheers, Lois. Good to see you, friend. And she says in the second book, she says, my words have been twisted and tattered in so many different ways that they've really lost a lot of the context. JJ, hello. Oh my gosh. I hope that means you're traveling and having a wonderful trip. So, not to contradict you, but I think that we all at some point had that understanding, and then it shifts. Yeah, so read the book on grief and grieving. And David Kessler has a great TED Talk. You might enjoy listening to that. But there's grief. The other thing that's interesting about grief, JJ, I'm good. I hope you are too. The other thing that's really interesting is our grief is completely dependent on the circumstances of the death and the relationship that we have to the deceased. And it's so interesting that the social support that you have during the grief response can make or break your grief experience. That was my research. And then there's a significant arm or body of additional research that says, oh shoot, I just lost my train of thought. Social support, that people think that the grief experience itself fits inside this little box. When I lost my first husband, I had a very delayed grief response. He had been in Europe or in Asia for 6 months, and there was a part of my brain that really just kind of compartmentalized and said, "Ooh, I think you're out there. You're out there. I don't know where you are, but you'll be back." And it was easily 6 months before I had more of a traditional grief reaction. Oh, Tanya, my sis was murdered on your birthday. Ugh. I'm estranged from my dad, but I really worry about the grief I'll feel when I find out he dies. Yeah, that's a oh my gosh, you guys. Yeah, you took her a turkey sandwich. On Rocky's and my wedding anniversary, I took a bottle of champagne that we had gotten as a wedding gift, and I went and sat on his grave, against his gravestone, and drank it. I was trashed. I had to walk to my mother's. I could walk to my mother's from there. But I literally just kind of sat in the cemetery and drank this bottle of warm champagne and cried and, did all the things that you would do. I'm pretty sure it was 1985, so it was our third wedding anniversary. It was the first one after his death. And yeah, we do funky things, don't we, in grief? Franny, I am a licensed professional counselor in LPC. I'm also a national certified counselor. I have a master's degree. I have an undergrad degree in psychology, a master's degree in mental health counseling. What else do you want to know? I've been in practice for 10 years, 11 years. I was a financial advisor for 20 years, and then I had kind of a midlife. How do I want to say this? I had a midlife reality check, and then decided to become a therapist. Can I help anybody? No. I would like to think so, but I think the better answer, the more true answer is no. A redirection, that's right. Nana, I can help a lot of people, but I definitely specialize in some areas. Like, I'm not an expert in personality disorders, eating disorders, severe mental health ailments like schizophrenia. I'm acquainted with all of those things, but I'm not an expert in those areas. I consider myself an expert in personal growth, women's issues. I do a lot of marriage counseling and teen anxiety. So for some reason, I have a lot of teenage clients that gravitate toward me. Oh, someone who lost a loved one. Well, that I'm also sadly an expert in. My research when I was in grad school, my research was about grief. I've lost 2 husbands, a sister, my parents. Um, so yes, that I'm also an expert on in a couple of different ways. I imagine you're going off your doctorate. You know, Franny, I am not. I am not going for my doctorate. I have thought about it. I live in Newark, Delaware, where the University of Delaware is. And if you live in the city limits of the university, once you hit 60, you can go to school for free. You don't have to pay tuition, which is a huge perk for those of us who are kind of academic junkies. And you have to still get into the program, so I'd still have to qualify to get into a doctorate program. But I've thought about it, but I would be crazy AF to add one more thing to my plate. Like, I mean, crazy. If I even pull out the admission paperwork, somebody needs to slap me upside the head and say stop. Because my passion is creativity. And, you know, I paint, I write, I have a full practice. I have 4 kids. They're grown, but still, I have 2 grandkids. I need to finish the novel. And honestly, after that novel, there's another one in there. And after that one, I would love to just be writing for the next 20 years. So, having said that, I have to finish the 1 manuscript or do something with the 1 manuscript that I have. Ooh, that's a good question. Do you think the grief of a relationship and the grief of a lost loved one take the same path? They can. I think to some extent it depends. You know, what's interesting about a lost relationship is it's a little bit like that woman who was abused who loses her husband, right, to death. When there's anger involved in the grief experience, there's a different dynamic, and oftentimes in a breakup, like when a marriage breaks up, that's definitely a grief response. But there's anger, and anger can mitigate that response, right? So it's not that people have to be angry. It's that people often are angry. Sometimes they're angry because they have all these other emotions that they don't know what to do with, and it comes out as anger. Something that's also very important to consider is that when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote that book back in the 70s, only a tiny little fraction of the understanding of the breadth and depth of emotions that we have today even existed. So she was writing based on what was kind of culturally and psychologically available data then, and today there's just so much more depth to that data. And psychology is a new science, relatively speaking, right? It's a soft science and it's a new science, newish. And so what we learned, or what, you know, people wrote about, the essence is still very important. But I think we just know so much more about human behavior and emotions, and we're always just trying to kind of apply that to what keeps coming up. You know, Lauren, it's such, my daughters have a very similar fear. But keep in mind, and so this is another super interesting thing, and this might even Tanya or Franny kind of answer part of your question. Some people grieve a loss way before a death occurs, right? Some people grieve a loss way before a death occurs. And for example, Lauren, you've already grieved, based on what you're saying here, you've already grieved the loss of your father. The father, right? The father is the person that is there for us, blah, 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 blah. The father isn't, you've grieved that loss. The man is a different kind of loss, right? So here's another thing. I'm going to get all sappy on you. And so many of you know that, or if you know my story, you know that my ex and my little sister had an affair. Blah, blah, blah. I don't want to talk about that, but I want to talk about this idea that my sister, who I hadn't talked to in 15 years because of this, she was essentially gone, right? Thank you, baking. She was gone, right? And she was gone from me emotionally. And then they got married. And I had such a fierce reaction to that. So calling my therapist and saying, I need to work through some things. So I get over there and I start talking and I'm like, you know what it is? There's this finality, right? There was a part of me, I think, that subconsciously, Jessie, how are you? That subconsciously held on to this idea for all those years that somehow she would come back. Like she would clear her senses, whatever, that she would come back. Now, people would ask me that all the time and say, I don't know if I'd even have a relationship with her. I don't know. But the point is that there was this kind of open possibility. And when they got married, that cinched the deal for me. Like that was the final, I don't know, whatever term you want to use. And that I had to grieve that. Like I had grieved it in portions, right? All the way up. And then there was this finality to it that was like putting the top on. And that was its own kind of grief. So I think that grief is just this really fascinating thing. And I think people don't understand it. Talk about expectations. We have ideas of what grief looks like, which is completely unique culturally. And not only is it, I mean, it's just, gosh, it's complex for sure. Grief and trauma has the same effects on the brain. Yes. And remember, sometimes grief is traumatic. Don't forget that. There are lots of grief experiences that are very traumatic. For crying out loud, my husband was electrocuted in front of me and died 10 days later before we'd even been married for 3 years. That's traumatic. That's a trauma. You know what's crazy is that I never saw a counselor about that. Nobody ever treated it as if it was a trauma. It was never addressed as a trauma when I eventually did go back to therapy or go start seeing a therapist, because these parts of psychology are new. And it's, it's not like psychologists have had all this information all this time and we've been withholding it. It's that we're constantly learning and hypothesizing and testing. And the other part of psychology, don't forget, is that when you study behavior, you need time. All of the stuff, not all of them, I'm really trying to check my absolute language these days. So much of the studies are designed with longitudinal elements, which means time, right? So by the time you observe all of these people under this condition and observe them all under that condition, there's really not much about that kind of research that's just quick. And so, gosh, just in the time that I've been, like, I went back to school in 2005. Here it is 16 years later. And just back, positive psychology was new science in 2005. And EMDR they thought it was a quacky treatment. I remember a professor, I did a presentation in my cognitive science class. And my aunt lived in California and she was getting EMDR because when my mother died, it was her sister and their parents, both my grandparents and my mom, all died within 3 months of each other. So my aunt had a traumatic grief experience. She lost literally half her family, different reasons, but half of her family inside of 3 months. That's traumatic grief, can be traumatic grief. Is complicated grief the same as traumatic grief? I don't know if there's actually a diagnosis of traumatic grief. I think I'm just using that term. Complicated grief is diagnosed when someone is still having a disruptive grief experience 24 months after the loss. That's by definition. So traumatic grief, I'm using as a word to describe the grief from a traumatic loss, if that helps. This is what I love about this platform, is the opportunity to share with you, to normalize that you can go through shit and you can come out the other side, that you can have bad experiences and still find strength because that's who you are. I could talk for literally weeks about making meaning out of losses and out of events. When I do get that novel finished, the essence of the story will be my life. I need to shift it. I need to shift some things around in it. But the essence of it will still be, how does anybody, what do you do when life just throws you one thing after another? And how do you come out of that? How do you find yourself? And it really, I think it's about looking in the mirror and believing that there's something bigger than you, and then trusting it. And I'm not very religious, but I do believe that there's something bigger. And and more powerful at play here. Whether it's, I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it's made the difference for me. Right? I learned how to accept that these things happen and that there was some lesson in it for me, or some value, right? I made meaning out of it, no matter what it was. If it's raining today, I'm going to tell you that I needed that rain. I needed a day where I could just slow down. And so then I become grateful for the rain. When Harlan died, I was sick with grief for that. But there were more moments, and ultimately the best moments, of just being so incredibly grateful that he was in my life. I became so grateful for having had him that it overpowered the sadness of losing him. I'm so incredibly grateful for my daughters that it overpowers the pain of that marriage. So gratitude's not the religion. I'm not religious, but gratitude is the thing, part of the thing that gives meaning to all of those experiences. Cheers. Have a good night. Have a good week.